Facing resistance from British Columbia, Kinder Morgan's Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion project was at the center of an emergency cabinet meeting in Ottawa today. And when the Natural Resources Minister emerged, he simply reiterated the government's support for the project.
The government is 100% behind this pipeline. It's important for Canada. It was made in the national interests. We believe that this is important for all regions of the country. We stand behind our decision.
There was no explanation of how Ottawa will force British Columbia to get on board with the project. Earlier this week, Kinder Morgan announced it's halting all non-essential construction on the pipeline expansion. Alberta Premier Rachel Notley has suggested her province is willing to buy the pipeline outright if that's what it takes to get it built. British Columbia Premier, meantime, says rising tensions over the pipeline is due to the ultimatum laid out by Kinder Morgan.
I do believe that the company, the Texas-based company that you refer to, is deliberately trying to dial up crisis within our Canadian Federation. I think that's disappointing, and I think all British Columbians share my view that we need to find a way forward that meets everyone's interests. And what I've been trying to do since I was sworn in is to live by the rule of law. I would prefer that the government of Alberta and the federal government join with us to resolve the jurisdictional question that's before us. They're choosing another course.
For more on this story, let's bring in political analyst Michael Gagan. He joins us now from Victoria. Michael, let's start with that emergency cabinet meeting. No concrete decision announced. You got to wonder what happened there behind closed doors.
Well, I'm sure there was a very heated discussion in terms of what they're going to do. The Prime Minister has staked his and his government's credibility on getting this pipeline project through. There's many, many billions of dollars in investment into Canada that's at stake here. You have Alberta, which is forced to sell its hydrocarbons at a discounted price to the United States because they don't have a pipeline access or an adequate pipeline access to the West Coast. It definitely is a high-stakes poker game, and unfortunately for British Columbians, it's one where right now it looks like it's heading towards a situation where British Columbia taxpayers could potentially be on the hook for a multi-billion-dollar lawsuit. So this is definitely getting very serious. Okay,
so a lawsuit for BC. Do we see this pipeline being built? I'm hearing all sorts of phrases like, it's on life support, it's dead. What do you think about that? Can it move forward?
Well, you know, for example, if Alberta decides to invest in the pipeline project, then clearly they'll have the investment dollars to proceed. And not only that, in terms of any legal action that may be taken, Alberta can obviously match dollar for dollar the legal defense fund of British Columbia. So you would have Albertan taxpayers facing off in court against British Columbia taxpayers. The unfortunate thing for John Horgan is that he and his government said that they would do basically everything possible to stop this pipeline when they were in opposition, should they become government. So it's pretty hard for them to argue in court that, hey, we were just following due process and it's just a darn shame that the pipeline failed. There's also, I was talking to one chief earlier today, and he was expressing annoyance about the fact that I believe it's 70% of the First Nations along the pipeline route have entered into agreements with Kinder Morgan, and yet it keeps getting presented as if, you know, all you know, Native Canadians are First Nations Canadians are opposed to this project, when in fact there's a sizable number that see some benefit from it. I know that Beecher Bay First Nation, for example, has a Coast Guard station that they're anxious to see established for, you know, enhanced spill response, not just for Kinder Morgan, but for all, you know, the many American tankers that go by our water. So it's definitely a discussion that has a lot of people increasingly anxious.
A lot of people means further delays, unfortunately, or potentially. You're saying that 70% of these Indigenous communities are on board. Of course, we know Alberta's on board. We know Ottawa wants this, BC. Mr. Horgan, Premier Horgan, obviously having to fulfill that campaign promise. But how much leverage or force does Ottawa have to move this forward?
Yeah, actually, well, they have several different kinds of leverage. First of all, the legal leverage is in Ottawa's favor for the reasons I stated earlier. Second of all, you know, Trudeau, in looking at this, it's not the NDP and it's not the Greens who are gaining on him. It's the Conservatives, and the Conservatives have made no secret as to what they would do in terms of getting this pipeline approved. Similarly, in Alberta, Rachel Notley isn't facing potential defeat from a coalition of Greens or what have you. They're facing the potential of defeat by Jason Kenney and the Conservatives. So, and even in British Columbia, when they've done polling, it shows that there's 22% of British Columbians are strongly supportive of this project. Another 22% are somewhat supportive. But in terms of those who are strongly opposed, it's only about 10% of British Columbians. So anyone looking at these numbers is going, you know what? The majority of Canadians and the majority of British Columbians are on board with this. So it is, and when you've got so many billions of dollars in investment at stake, it's something where inaction will be just as devastating it will be just as devastating as if the federal government came in and said, we're stopping the pipeline, because it'll have the same effect.
Very interesting. Well, we know that Kinder Morgan has given the BC government, that May 31st deadline to agree to step aside. We'll be talking about this in the days and weeks ahead, I'm sure, but we'll have to leave it there for now. Political analyst Michael Geoghegan joining us from Toronto. Thank you for this.
Thank you.